Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. For those who don't know me, my name is Wesley Fors and I'm the CEO of APPA. And on the screen, you'll see our speakers today, or two of our speakers from today. Sonia Duncan from SD Strategies and Alexander Walbert from SEDEX. Sean Joyce from Real Pet Food Company will be joining us shortly. We were just doing some practice IT runs. He had to shoot off to do a couple of things and will join us just before his presentation starts. So look, I'm now going to share my screen, which includes our program for today. Just while I provide a bit of context around sort of how we've come about today and what we've been doing in the background. So APPA's journey with modern slavery really started sort of late last year, where we ran or hosted a workshop with about 10 or so members, and some of you have joined us today, so good to see you here. And that workshop was facilitated by Sonia. So Sonia is a consultant across a lot of different areas, including modern slavery. And the outcome of that workshop was to develop a ethical sourcing and modern slavery policy for our members as a free resource. And Sonia will be providing more context around that policy during her presentation. So look, last year's workshop, this policy, today's seminar and future seminars is really in response to the Modern Slavery Act, which came out in January 2019, which requires businesses in Australia with a turnover of at least $100 million to take steps to address their modern slavery risks and to report on these. And Alex will be providing more context around the background with the Act as well and the reporting requirements in his presentation. The first round of reporting from these companies started last year. So what APPA members were experiencing was requests from these reporting entities, and apparently there's about 6,000 of these in Australia, for proof of policies and procedures of how our members are addressing modern slavery within their business through different policies and processes. So this is the start of APPA's, journey with modern slavery as well. We have been working closely with Sonia, and I believe we will be doing more so in the future. And this is really our first, piece of education for APPA members. So today we do have three speakers, as introduced, Alex from SEDEX, and Alex will be providing an overview of modern slavery, an overview of the Act, what responsible sourcing is, why it is becoming more increasingly important for business, and to look at some of the longer term implications and ways of efficiently implementing responsible sourcing. Sean is the Global Head of Procurement for the Real Pet Food Company, and he's been instrumental in leading their response to modern slavery and the legislation. And Sean will provide us with a real case study and provide insight into the practical implementation of ethical sourcing within a large corporation. And then we'll wrap up with Sonia from SD Strategies, who will introduce APPA's new member resource, the Ethical Sourcing and Modern Slavery Policy, how this links to the code, and how members will be able to access that after today's seminar. So I'll just unshare my screen now. If you do have any questions throughout the presentations, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function within Zoom. I'm sure Alex and Sonia and Sean will be happy to answer your questions either during the presentation or at the end of each presentation. And now, Alex, I'll hand it over to you if you could please share your screen and commence your presentation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Wes. Okay. Thank you, everyone. And yes, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to jump in. So let's kick things off. So very quickly, and this is not about SEDEX, and I'm not here to make this all about SEDEX, just a bit of context of who I am and what we do. So SEDEX was started 16 years ago in Europe as a way for organizations to share risk information around responsible sourcing practices. So labor practices, business ethics, environment, occupational health and safety. So sharing question sets, sharing audits. And so now we have over 60,000 members in 180 countries. my role as head of office is I work with a dedicated team in Australia, in Sydney, and also in Japan to support our members, both on the buyer side, so large corporate organizations that are looking to risk assess and understand more about the products and services going into their supply chain, and by extension, your customers and suppliers. So we've got a fairly broad mix, but very, very strong in retail facing. We have some of the world's largest organizations as members. Probably the biggest would be Walmart and Amazon. But in Australia, we have Coles, Woolworths, Aldi. We've got everything from Officeworks and Wing through to David Jones, Bunnings, etc. So there's a fairly broad mix of members in there. And in short, what it is a way for suppliers to answer a set of questions and their suppliers, and then to share that information. And then in the middle, you have auditors who will, these are often independent, will come in and conduct an audit to verify various aspects of what's happening. And then anything that's identified can then be tracked. So that's SEDEX. Now let's talk about modern slavery. And modern slavery as a concept is a term of art. It's not something that has been very, very clearly defined, but it takes into account what we would consider to be the worst and most egregious abuses and exploitative practices. So human trafficking, slavery, forced labor, child labor, and similar debt bondage. So we're talking about the worst aspects and exploitative practices in business for labor hire. So that gives us some context as to what it is. So we're not talking about, for instance, workers being short paid or a little bit of unpaid overtime here or there. We're talking about within the spectrum. We're talking about what is at the very worst end. Now, this is a global problem. It's very easy to think that perhaps it's exclusive to certain countries, but it is prevalent everywhere. It's just a question of how much. And as you can see, based on the darkness of the colors, that this is very prevalent in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, but it's present to varying degrees in every country, including Australia. And so here are some stats. Now, whilst the incidence rate in Australia is obviously lower than in other countries, it is still very much a problem. And if anything, these numbers are particularly low because of underreporting and because it is not particularly well understood. And this is part of what the legislation is supposed to be achieving. So the challenge is that globally, we are all in some ways buying, be it in business or as individuals, products that use slave labor. And so to give you an example, $12 billion, according to The Economist, worth of dollars spent in Australia has been on goods that are linked to modern slavery. So this is not a small problem. It's not obvious, but it is absolutely prevalent. And so what kind of goods can be covered? A vast array, depending on where, anything from cocoa, for instance, sugar, cotton, rare earths, and what we call the 3TG, so tin, tungsten, tantalum, gold, palm oil. There is a massive list, as you can see, of goods, commodities that have involved slave labor. And probably the most common ones for everyday use, chocolate, obviously, tinned seafood, shrimp, being fished in Southeast Asia, for instance. No, it's a very, very big list. So what does it actually look like? Well, this is coltan mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So what is happening is we've got kids who are mining coltan, which is used in smartphones and other electronic devices by hand, under armed guard, with the money being used to fuel domestic or civil conflicts. Right. So again, does this affect all of us? Yes. If you've got a smartphone, could well be that it involves or it has coltan that was dug by hand in the Congo. This is Mozambique. We have children breaking up mica by hand for use in cosmetics and paints. This also happens in India as well. This is the face of forced labor. Uzbekistan, picking of cotton. Southeast Asia, we have people who, from Burma and Cambodia, who have been trafficked onto vessels that stay in international waters. They never leave. So they can't be raided by coast guards because they're not in anyone's domestic waters. And so they sit out there with ships bringing the seafood to port. So next time you get canned seafood, have a think about, where it's coming from. So to go back to some of the common misconceptions, it is not an undeveloped or third world problem. It is a global problem. It's just a question of scale. And it is very much here in Australia. In fact, there was an article I saw today in the West Australian talking about the trafficking of migrants for construction in Western Australia. And 5 people have just been arrested and deported over that from Malaysia. Walk Free estimates that there are 13,000 people in slave-like conditions in Australia. This is not just a criminal justice problem. It's not a question of just migration. It is broader than that. And it can be very, very hard to find if you're not looking for it. And so put another way, it's easy to ignore. If you think that there is no forced labor in your supply chain, then you probably, candidly, haven't looked hard enough. Because go down far enough, you may very well find it. And people like to think that they don't actively buy, and we don't actively buy goods that have been made with, forced labor. But sadly, these things can enter the supply chain because of, a lack of due diligence. And as consumers or as businesses, we inadvertently purchase these. So it's difficult. So let's talk about what is responsible sourcing and what's driving it, right? So responsible sourcing is an approach to sourcing and supply chains that's about actively and consciously procuring and purchasing in an ethical, sustainable, and socially conscious way. So in other words, not being focused exclusively on cost, but looking at the broader impacts of what you're purchasing and why, and the externalities of that. That being said, what is responsible sourcing and the approach taken varies considerably from company to company, country to country. So there's a huge amount of variation, and that's something to take into consideration. There is no really one size fits all. So in terms of SEDEX, we look at responsible sourcing as being 4 distinct elements: ethics, labor, occupational health and safety, and environmental standards. These are all things that we would consider to be part of responsible sourcing. And again, this is not driven by something specifically Australian. It's looking at the Ethical to Trade Initiative's base code. It's looking at ISO standards and International Labour Organization conventions. So we're not talking about a specifically Australian set of circumstances. We're talking about globally accepted principles. But modern slavery in the Australian context sits very much within labour standards, if you like. And so think of modern slavery as being one part of broader responsible sourcing, which is why there is that clear relationship between the two. And people will be looking to cover off their modern slavery obligations by virtue of their responsible sourcing policy. So they'll talk about responsible sourcing and modern slavery. So again, looking at the linkage between modern slavery and responsible sourcing, so we use the ETI base code as an example. There are plenty of other models out there, but you can see emphasis on employment is freely chosen. Child labour shall not be used. No harsh or inhuman treatment. So this is the linkage, if you like, between modern slavery and modern slavery compliance and responsible sourcing. Again, looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, poverty, decent work, reduced inequalities, gender equality. So these are aspects of forced labor and modern slavery that tie into the broader narrative of sustainable development. So what's driving the change? There's a number of different factors, and again, it varies from country to country and sector to sector, but broadly, there is increased interest in sustainability. Climate change, biodiversity, water scarcity, emphasis on reduce, reusing, recycling. This all ties into that broader responsible sourcing narrative. The investment community is increasingly active, and we're seeing this in terms of fund flows. Institutional investors are requiring more and more information on the companies that they invest in, and this is an area they're focusing on. You have more active and vocal consumers as well, who are interested not only in their main retail relationships, and this ties in with, if you like, where SEDEX has got more members, fashion, retail, food, strong consumer-facing industries, but that is spreading into other areas as well. You have brands that are differentiating themselves and emphasizing their sustainability credentials as part of how they differentiate themselves in market from others. And you can see that very much in the fashion industry as well. Another example, look at Beyond Bank or Bank Australia and some of the ads that they've run. You see this in financial services, you see this in insurance. So it's not just what you consider traditional consumer-facing businesses. And there's obviously a lot more media, thanks to the increased use of social media as a way of distributing information. We're seeing more focus on negative practices, and it's being spread through the likes of Instagram, etc., and Facebook. And we are seeing more active NGOs and civil society actors. So they have, the likes of Get Up, for instance, they're getting a lot more money and a lot more active because it's easier for them to organize. So that's one aspect, but there's also legislation. And if you like, there is this increasing bouncing or playing off against or positive feedback between jurisdictions around legislation. So the UK introduced its Modern Slavery Act. Australia has followed. Ours is stricter. The UK is now looking to strengthen its as well. Canada has some legislation working its way through. You may have seen New South Wales has one that hasn't been enacted, but has been passed. And that has financial penalties and is for companies doing over 50 million. So there's discussion around harmonisation between the state and the federal authorities over that. But this is the trend, if you like. New Zealand is now looking at it. So we're not seeing legislation being weakened anywhere. We're seeing it being strengthened. And then you've also got in the US, for instance, their customs and border officials blocking the importation of gloves from Malaysia, blocking the importation of cotton from Xinjiang and goods from Xinjiang. So again, we're seeing more activity by governments as well. And this is all, if you like, leading to a change in the new normal, the new landscape. Retail investors have indicated that human rights violations and labor rights violations are major concerns for them. And investors, the funds that they are invested in are following suit. We're seeing increased growth in responsible investments. Again, they're setting requirements. Because in the end, looking at it purely financially, the risk has an impact on valuations. It has an impact on earnings volatility and stability, because major problems can cause impact in share prices. And as you can see via Boohoo, for instance, they had a scandal. Their share price dived. They got dumped by some of their fund managers. Again, Malaysian companies, in this case Top Glove, having to reimburse workers for recruitment fees, significant amount of money. And these are the kind of things that investors are worried about. So all of this, social change, negative aspects of global trade, brand scandals and market positioning is all flowing into the drivers for responsible sourcing, which has a direct impact on you, because the expectations by investors and civil society influences procurement, which influences expectations from suppliers. So I'll give you an example of, speaking of Modern Slavery Act in Australia, there is a public register for organisations that have to submit. I took 2 screenshots, one from October last year, one from February. As you can see, the number of searches gone from 14,000 through to 115,000. So lots and lots of people are having a look at these statements and reading them, be it media organisations, be it NGOs, or everyday consumers. People are looking at these, and companies are being judged accordingly. So what does the new normal, if you like, look like? So expect to be asked questions and to have to complete self-assessment information on labour practices, whether it's through SEDEX or some other questionnaire put out by your customer. Expect to see lots of these come through, varying quality, but you will see more. Expect to have to facilitate audits or provide audit information. And probably one of the most challenging things is going to be, people will want to see where the factory is. They will want to see audit reports around the factories. They will want to know who, because, and to give you an example, I had a conversation with one of the big 4 banks a couple of days ago about this. There is huge concern about branded goods or promotional products, and they have the number of big members of SEDEX who have flagged promotional products, uniforms, as being a major concern in this area is significant, because there's that concern about having something with their brand on it that gets linked to exploitative practices further down the supply chain. So they want to look into it. They will want to see detailed policies, particularly around things like modern slavery, use of labour hire providers or brokers, and discrimination. It varies, though. There's a huge amount of variation. So don't expect it to be, identical across the board. But rule of thumb, Australia, UK, Europe, US is more active. Retail or consumer facing is more active, and if there is a strong brand alignment. So if you're interested in seeing what's likely to happen, have a look at the CSR ESG reporting and commentary by your customers. That will give you an indication of what's coming down the line. So what can you do? Due diligence is super important. Know your suppliers and start having these conversations. Keep your policies up to date and make sure they're being adhered to, and candidly have a plan if something does go wrong. Invest in relationships, build trust, and communicate. And this works for your customers and for your suppliers, so that there is alignment. What is this? What information do you need? How are you going to use it? How are you going to use it to meet customer requirements? Think about training, not just for your own, executives or business owners, but think of it more broadly and within an organization, so everyone is across it in some way. And again, understand your customers' expectations around this. The process is effectively the same whether you're using SEDEX or doing this by yourself with Sonia with a small number of suppliers. You're using a human rights due diligence approach, which is understanding the country and sector risks. So just do some research, read the paper, see what it says about, there's plenty of free resources online. Walk Free or Minda is fantastic for this. Look at audits, request audits, do site visits. Are there certifications that your suppliers have got? So in terms of what can you do with it is basically zero cost. Request 2 years worth of audits or multiple years worth of audits and see how things have tracked over time. Independent audits from, SEDEX's SMETA or Amphori's BSCI, and see how have they performed and are they addressing the issues that have been raised? Are you seeing improvement over time? If they've already had these audits done, that shouldn't cost you anything extra. And that information you can ultimately pass on to your customer if they request it. But reviewing those kind of audit reports will help a considerable amount. And if they don't have them, then candidly, Why not? Are they too small? Is it a question of cost? Because if they're not able to have an audit done, then what does that, are you putting your brand and your business at risk? So here are some of the common objections. It's too expensive. We can't pass an audit. If you hear any of these, then think about, yes, but what is the implication and the impact on your business, given that where customers are coming from and the potential risk to your own business. So again, take stock of your supplier list, review free information that's online and elsewhere, work out your internal guidelines, communicate those widely, start a dialogue with suppliers, review audit information, and do it every 6 months. And that's it from me.
Great, thank you, Alex. Some potential implications there for the future of the industry in relation to identifying promo products and obviously asking for those audits from the factories as well. Absolutely. Now, I have noticed that Nathan from Ethical Merch is on the line and he's put his hand up. So Nathan, I'm just going to allow you to talk. Hopefully this works if you do have a question. Are you there, Nathan?
I am. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks. Thanks for joining us.
That's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Did you have a question for Alex, mate?
I didn't have a question. I just acknowledged Alex being online. So sorry, I don't have a question, but I can create one in a second.
No, that's okay. You can have a think about it. You can ask again later if you like.
Thanks, mate.
Okay, cheers. Okay, Sean, are you there, Sean?
Yep, I am here.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Sean. I did do an introduction earlier on from the speakers and what each speaker will be covering. So you're more than happy to share your screen now and start your presentation for us.
Okay. Okay, can everyone see that okay? All right, great.
Indeed.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I guess I'm just going to spend the next 10, 15 minutes going through the responsible sourcing strategy that we put together at Real Pet Food. For those that aren't aware, we are the second largest pet food company in Australia, with 8 manufacturing sites across Australia and New Zealand, and then a couple of manufacturing sites also in the UK and into Asia. Part of what we've been working over the last 12 months is pulling together a responsible sourcing strategy, which is sort of where this one pager covers off what our responsible sourcing strategy is. I'm glad to say that the onset of modern slavery certainly sped up our strategy around this. I've been with the business for almost 5 years. That's the length the business has existed. So in a previous role, in a previous life at Nestle, responsible sourcing was sort of embedded into the business since 2005, 2006. So it's quite interesting starting from scratch in a business and with a white canvas, if you like, and being able to create something from scratch. Basically, this slide covers off our 5 pillars that we look at in responsible sourcing. One of the main pillars being modern slavery and modern slavery in our operations and in our supply chain. I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but you can sort of see the other 4 pillars that exist within there, which is around sustainable packaging and what we're doing with sustainable packaging and the guidelines for implementation. Importantly, vendor assurance. So not only putting in place a program that reviews our current vendors, but also what are we doing for new vendors that we bring on board? So an onboarding process. So through the vendor approval process, how can we ensure that we're covering off modern slavery and responsible sourcing at the same time? So not just looking retroactively. putting in place a supply risk matrix, so looking at who are our highest risk suppliers outside of just modern slavery risk. And then importantly, looking at systems and processes. What policies do we have in place? What processes do we have in place at the moment? And going forward, what systems do we need that allows us to evaluate what we are doing and what we've done previously? So if we go into the modern slavery journey, it's an interesting one. I remember the first day our HR director came into my office and threw on my desk a statement, a draft statement, a modern slavery statement. She goes, and this was about the middle of last year. She said, "Oh, can you just read through this? Just quickly read through it, and give me some feedback. This is what we're going to publish for modern slavery." At the time, I didn't know a lot about modern slavery. I'd certainly heard about it, but I hadn't reviewed it. And the first thing I did was download the Act and read all 96 pages of it. And it became very clear that this was not a tick and flick exercise. And it's certainly one that needed a lot more work than just, can you look over it and highlight where you think we have some exposure. So straight away, I went out and tried to find some help, because I could see it was a pretty big job. And certainly when you read through the Act, you can see how comprehensive it is. And then that's where I brought SD strategies in to assist. And from there, we began our journey, which is, how do we get to a point where we're comfortable with a statement that we put out, but not only comfortable with it, it represents the ethics within our business, which I think is an important aspect of modern slavery. So I'll just walk you through the journey. The first thing we did, which was a really good exercise, was, okay, what does awareness look like within our business? We did a modern slavery awareness workshop, whereby we provided an overview around modern slavery. 61 participants across 5 countries, covering all the main functions within our business. At the same time, we sent out a survey prior to the workshop, just to understand, what did people know about modern slavery? So, can you define the term modern slavery to a colleague? There's the results showing, some they could to a small degree. How many people are on modern slavery globally? So some people got it right, some people got it horribly wrong. How relevant do you think modern slavery risk management is to real pet food? You can sort of see everywhere from highly relevant to not relevant at all. What is your understanding of modern slavery risks inherent to real pet food? I know about the risk. Yep, I could name 1 or 2. I have no idea. And then what would you do if modern slavery was found in your supply chain? So I know who to speak to. I don't know who to speak to. For the most part, people were aware of modern slavery. Did they know what to do with that information? No. Did they think modern slavery was, at a very basic level, child labor in Africa? For the most part, yes. And did they think that it existed in Australia? Not a chance. So it was an interesting exercise, and we learned a lot out of it, and certainly set the benchmark for, or the baseline, let's call it, for where we wanted to start from. The next exercise was around a gap analysis workshop. A really good piece of work, a tough piece of work, if I'm honest. We had to do it online, obviously, because of COVID. Certainly something that you would get, it's a little bit easier to do face-to-face, but we held 5 sessions across those 5 streams. So management systems, risk management, human resources, customers, stakeholders, and supply chain, with various senior level executives within the business. So we had a lot of our directors on these calls, where there were a bunch of questions that we asked around those various streams. And then what we get out of it is what you see there. Now, this slide here is one that certainly generated a lot of discussion within our business. The first one being, wow, why are we so bad? And it does look bad, no doubt about it. But what it shows is that we are right at the beginning of our journey of modern slavery. It's less about being good or bad. It's about, let's have a honest assessment on where we're sitting. And a lot of those areas, if we talk about human resources, we've got policies and systems in place, and we've had them for a number of years. Do they reference modern slavery? No. If I think about procurement, and that's certainly my role as the head of procurement, that's the area where I'm most comfortable. We've got contract management, we've got screening in place, we've got supplier engagement. Do we specifically call out modern slavery? No. So straight away, that starts out as, you know, a lot of work to be done. So I'm more comfortable than probably anyone else at our business with this slide, just because I think it's a good starting point to show where we actually came from, and we'll start to see an improvement on that already, and we plan to have another look at that before we submit our statement to see where we've moved, and you know, hopefully there'll be a few more yellows in there, a few less reds, but a really good exercise, and it really challenged our business to answer some of the tough questions that Sonia and the team presented to us. The next step was moving on to an action planning workshop. So in each of those areas that we looked at, each of those streams, we then started pulling together a Trello board around what the actions were. This is where you sort of really get into the nuts and bolts of modern slavery. So what actions do we need to improve on those first metrics? It was good because it allowed us to have responsibility, accountability. We'll be able to prioritize around, you know, low, medium, high priorities, and more importantly, give timelines. The important thing with modern slavery is you can't do everything in the first year, and that's the piece that we had to get across to our executives, is that, wow, we've got so much to do. How do we do it in the first year? This is really about showing what you can do in the first year, and then building a pipeline for year 2, 3, 4, having a roadmap. We can't do everything in the first year, so that's this workshop was a good one for us to try and understand where are the priorities, where some of the quick wins that we can do, and then where some of the longer term initiatives we need to start working on. The next step was really looking at our risks and assessing our suppliers. So we assessed our suppliers across 3 key determinants: geography, sector, and commodity. By gathering information across those 3 key determinants, we were then able to pull together a risk profile. So we pulled data, spend data, and region and sector and commodity data across all of our sites. So the US, the UK, China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. And that got fed into a matrix and a model that then allowed us to start reviewing our suppliers. So you can sort of see there we reviewed $80 million worth of spend across 1,900 suppliers and across 30 different categories. What comes out of that is you start to look at what your top 10, top 20 highest risk suppliers, and that can be suppliers that are guaranteed, that are classified as high risk for a number of different reasons, but it gives you a starting point to go, okay, who do we need to be speaking to, and where do we need to have a more productive or constructive conversation with? This slide I love because it's really around the dashboard, which is, okay, what did we actually see? So what did all that information provide us? And this is where the model that we used really starts to deliver value, and graphically you can start to tell the story to your business. So who are our high risk suppliers? What are our top 5 ranking categories that are highest risk? Where's our highest risk market? So ANZ, Hong Kong, US, UK, and then also out of those suppliers, what would we classify as high risk suppliers? So great piece of information, and finally we get to see, okay, where do we need to focus our time and effort, and how long will it take? From that, we then moved on to the next stage, which was looking at, okay, how do we choose the high risk suppliers to work on the next set of information gathering? What we then did was this year we pulled together the ability to at least go out to 50% of our high risk suppliers, which is in the end ended up 22 suppliers. We sent on basically those 20 suppliers, those 22 suppliers we went out to, and we sent 20 questions to them. This was a portal that SD Strategies pulled together, and it really, the SAQ consisted of 20 questions across 4 business areas. So operations and workforce, policy effectiveness, risk management, procurement, and supply chain. We got those out to those suppliers, and in that process, we managed to get some responses which we're working on at the moment. Interestingly enough, it's a web-based survey. You've got the one-on-one support both by SD Strategies, but also my team. And then what the suppliers will get, the respondents will get, is a customized report detailing the risk rating and the improvement recommendations. That it should be considered a value add for them. It's been tough. We've certainly been chasing a lot of them, and some of the high-level findings that have sort of come out is really where the interest level is, right? So we have a lot of suppliers that have operations in high-risk countries and regions, including Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa. Varied levels of sophistication for managing those modern slavery risks. So certainly what we've seen is that they can provide some level of justification for what they're doing, but once you challenge them a bit further, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So they certainly have modern slavery policies, but did they upload them and provide evidence? Not all the time. Also, 50% of the respondents are reporting entities. Sorry about the screen. Are reporting entities under the Modern Slavery Act. Less than half have undertaken formal modern slavery risk assessment. Yet 60% are confident there's no risk in their modern slavery. There's a red flag straight away. And then suppliers are procuring from high-risk countries. So the likes of China, India, Philippines, Thailand, Brazil, and Indonesia. Really, that starts when you're looking at your tier 2, 3, and 4. You're really going upstream and understanding where they're getting their raw materials or their services from. Interestingly enough, 30% have no due diligence process in place for managing modern slavery risks. So they might know what it is. They might say they are managing it, but do they have a due diligence in place? No. And then I think 75% do not include modern slavery clauses in their contract, which is a huge percentage. And some of these suppliers are major suppliers and vendors in Australia that just haven't gone along the journey yet of including clauses. So what are the next steps? So work with the high-risk suppliers identified by detailed analysis and documentation. So we've started that process already. We'll be doing we'll be going back to them with a deep dive. So we will choose 5 of those suppliers this year that we'll be doing a deep dive with and looking at how we can improve their responses and certainly what they're doing. We'll get a corrective action plan together. So each of them will be issued with a CAR and a full report, which allows them to look at what they are doing and what they could do better and where we see their biggest gaps. And then also put steps and time frames with each supplier. So a lot more difficult for the smaller businesses with limited resources, but certainly the bigger businesses, we want to sit down and start having those collaborative sessions whereby my procurement team, including SD Strategies, will go through what that looks like and start to map out, okay, this is where we think you have your biggest gaps, and this is where we would like to support you, and this is the support we can offer, with the view to, this is where we want to get to, which is all about managing risk and supporting the suppliers. The next slide I wanted to show you is just gives you an illustration of the varying degrees of, let's call it sophistication in terms of responses. So this is one supplier of ours that is not a small supplier. We do a couple of $1 million business with them. And through the SAQ, this was their response that they uploaded into the portal. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's a post-it note that's been written on by hand, and that's a response to one of the questions. And the response was, we have one employee and he is under an award wages and is paid correctly. That's how simple some people respond, or some vendors respond to it. And there's nothing against the supplier, but this is all new to them. And it's not, as I say, it's not a small supplier of ours. So there's a lot of work that we need to do with the supplier. On the right-hand side, you can see a response to a question. Is there any additional information regarding modern slavery risk management program you would like to provide? His answer, we have one employee, extremely low risk. We treat him very well. He is a great worker and a friend, and I like paying his wages, and his work is done and well every week. We're proud to be living in Australia. Once again, it's not an incorrect answer, but showing you that you have some companies that have policies in place that allow them to address modern slavery, and then you have other vendors out there that have nothing in place, and this is all completely new to them. So part of what we want to do in 2021 is start working with these suppliers, and we know we can't achieve everything in year one. We know these sort of suppliers do not have HR departments, they do not have compliance managers, they do not have the resources or the structure to deal with it. So how do we put in place a program that's suited to their size and suited to their resources, and will give them benefit and manage some of our modern slavery risks through our supply chain? And then lastly, that's really just graphically how we've gone. So started off the gap analysis, completed that, went through the action planning and had some really good workshops, came out of it with a very clear Trello board around what the actions were, and then lastly put together the roadmap. And once again, it's not just a 1-year roadmap with a statement, it's a 3-year roadmap that then forms the basis for our modern slavery statement that we will publish on the 30th of June this year. And that's it for me. Any questions?
No, I don't think there's any questions coming through, Sean. So, look, I'll just say thank you for your time today, Sean, and for your presentation.
Pleasure.
It's great to be able to provide a good insight into the amount of time and energy and commitment that you are putting through to modern slavery and what other big organisations are as well. And as you said, it's not a tick and flick exercise. It's not a short-term project either. It is going to take you a few years. So good luck with your journey over that period.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to present.
No problem. Thank you. So happy to stick around if you are, Sean, but appreciate if you've got to go as well.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Okay, Sonia, if you'd like to share your screen and we can conduct your presentation, which will be covering off the new modern day or ethical sourcing and modern slavery policy that we've developed together, which will soon be available to members. So over to you.
Great, thank you. So you can see the PowerPoint slide there because I can't see what you're seeing rather than the, so it's one slide, excellent. Thanks very much. And I think it's really important to just pick up from, I guess, where Sean left off, that's one company's approach. And while promotional products is still high risk in their sector, they focused on their highest spend. But that's not to mean that in future years, they're not going to continue to go down through their suppliers, their high risk suppliers, and start asking those same questions of some of the SME suppliers, such as yourselves as part of the APPA membership network. So I just wanted to highlight that in drawing on what Sean discussed, that some of you are already being asked those kind of 20 questions, if you like. So just to recap very quickly, and I know that that Alex has touched on all of this, but I don't know, Alex, if you actually said that the number of people globally in slavery, and I think it's really important to highlight that there are 40.3 million people estimated to be living in modern slavery globally. Nearly 3/4 of those are women, 1 in 4 are children, and it is a $150 billion industry globally. So it's a low risk, high return industry for those who are perpetuating this crime. And it is a crime under legislation almost in every country of the world. So that's the important kind of starting point. 15,000 people estimated to be living in modern slavery in Australia. But that number, while it may seem small relative to some of the other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, needs to be put into context of what this means for Australian companies and for you as promotional products providers, that a lot of what we're sourcing is coming from these countries that have a really high instance of modern slavery. So Southeast Asia, or Asia and the Pacific region, nearly 25 million people living in modern slavery there. So it's about, 2/3 of everyone globally in modern slavery comes from kind of our region where we source products from. So keeping that in mind, I guess, puts a bit of a different perspective on it for you. And again, Alex touched on the legislation, but I just wanted to highlight that this is exploding internationally. So in whatever jurisdiction you supply to, there's new legislation being put in place, being talked about, as Alex indicated, including, as he mentioned, Canada, New Zealand, but also Singapore, Germany, Norway, Finland. There's a new EU law on corporate due diligence proposed for this year. The Australian Act is probably leading the way at the moment. The US Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, the one Alex mentioned, that is stopping shipments coming into countries, and it then becomes the responsibility of the people buying that product to do the investigation, to do the due diligence. But you can imagine the loss of money from those companies if their product that they're importing is stopped at the border. There was some debate about Australia introducing similar legislation. So I think it's a kind of watch this space in that respect. So that, I guess, sets the framework of this. The Act, as you know, puts requirements on entities with annual consolidated revenue above $100 million to report annually on the modern slavery risks in their operations and supply chains and the actions they've taken to assess and address those risks, the effectiveness of those actions, and how they're consulting with other entities they own or control. So it's really easy, and what we've seen over the last kind of 3 or 4 years while this legislation was discussed was people went, oh, it's not going to be relevant to me. And especially SMEs, small to medium enterprises, like most of you and like me, we say, well, it's not relevant to us. But I guess, it is. The answer to that question, is it relevant to APPA members? If we're not a reporting entity, so the Act doesn't apply to us, is absolutely false. And for distributors amongst you, many of your customers will be reporting entities. For suppliers, you're obviously going to be part of your reporting entity's supply chain. You may be a tier 1 or a tier 2 supplier to them, being asked the sorts of questions that Sean just outlined. For manufacturers, obviously instrumental in helping understand and identify the risks within those promotional products themselves and the component parts that go into that. So absolutely highly relevant to APPA members. And as was pointed out by Wes at the beginning, APPA's been working on this for some time. So you've got a code of conduct already, and all members, including decorators, distributors and suppliers, have to comply with that code of conduct. And hopefully you're all super familiar with it, because as a member, these are the things that you said you're going to comply with. It encourages productive, ethical and mutually beneficial commercial relationships across the supply chain, and it covers a number of things, so fair business dealings, respecting personnel and fellow members, protecting the environment around, and as well as some other rules. It details the responsibility of members. So when we look at that and you think about what does that actually mean to you in terms of your responsibilities, members will not directly or indirectly use any form of forced labour, including indentured, prison, bonded or slave labour, will not use or allow the use of physical or verbal harassment or abuse. So directly or indirectly relates to the sort of language used in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which talks about whether you are causing, contributing or directly linked to modern slavery. So here you're saying you won't indirectly through your supply chain be involved in these sorts of things. So I guess the question is, how do you comply with your code of conduct? How do you report that back to your customers when they start asking you these sorts of questions? And what are you going to do to help you meet their requirements and obviously the legislative requirements. Now, some of the things are a little bit unfair, and I think some of the larger businesses are outsourcing their supply chain risk management to the smaller businesses. So, but I wanted to bring one example across for you about just thinking about that supply chain and what directly and indirectly might mean to you. So if we just think about plastics and we think about that in relation to the supply chain risks and what that means, and this is all the indirect stuff. This is where you sit in sales, or maybe you sit in warehousing and logistics, or even some of you in manufacturing. So there's a range of risks at this end of the supply chain, but those risks increase the further along the supply chain you go. And this is where there is very little visibility of that. But this is all the indirect stuff still that you say through your code of conduct that you're going to ensure doesn't occur. So one of the things that, as Wes said, that was really important, and one of the reasons for the policy development was that customer expectations are starting to be placed on you as small to medium businesses as well. And you're increasingly being asked to respond to these sorts of questionnaires like the one that Sean highlighted, and particularly if your customers are reporting entities under the Modern Slavery Act, because promotional products comes up as high risk, like it or not. That's the industry sector that you're sitting in. So here's an example of the sorts of questions or letters that are being sent out to APPA members. Your commitment to us is what your customers are saying. We seek your agreement to the terms set out in the appendix of this letter with respect to the supplies you make and your supply chain management. So those appendix terms are huge. So your customers are starting to ask you to demonstrate that you're not engaged in forced labour, slavery, servitude, trafficking in persons, that you don't do anything that might be an offence under any of these laws, that you will provide assistance to your customers when they reasonably request assistance to identify the risks in their supply chain, that you will, and this is the important one, implement, maintain and regularly review your systems, policies and procedures designed to assess and manage risks associated with forced labour, slavery, servitude, trafficking in persons in your own business and your supply chain, and otherwise facilitate that you comply with anti-slavery laws. So you need to think about due diligence, you need to think about audits. Some of your customers are going to ask you for written evidence of how you're doing this. So this is really quite significant for small to medium businesses, and thinking about the limited resources you have. The little note that Sean showed of one of their suppliers, who is a small business, sure, but supplies millions of dollars worth of product to them, is a classic example of that. They don't have the departments and the facilities necessarily to manage this to the extent that a reporting entity would. So when we started to think about this part, the policies, as Wes said, we got together with some of your members and worked on developing a policy collaboratively. So it wasn't a policy that I wrote or SD Strategies wrote for you. It was very much, it came from your membership. And some of the things that we came up with that we wanted to have included in that, you'll see now forming the basis of that ethical sourcing and modern slavery policy. So this is a policy that is available to members, but there's some restrictions on that. It's not going to be a tick and flick. It has to be linked to due diligence processes. So it's only available to members who will show a commitment to ethical sourcing and modern slavery risk management. So it's not mandatory, obviously, but it's recommended because many of you will be asked for policies in future from your customers as well. So it can be tailored to your own business. So you'll get it as a Word document. You can make changes to it within reason, but you must assess and address modern slavery risks in your supply chain to be able to access this policy, and you must educate yourselves on what this policy means. I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail. And right at the top of the policy is this statement here that it's available to APPA members who are committed to ethical sourcing, modern slavery risk management, should not be adopted by members not serious about its intent or implementation. The policy can and should be tailored to each member's individual needs. We've done this for other sectors as well, where they share the development of a policy across an industry sector, and then individual companies then implement that policy. What the policy does is it has kind of some key sections in it, and the first section is around responsibility. So what it does is acknowledges that most APPA members are SMEs, small to medium businesses with limited resources. You're not reporting entities under the Commonwealth Modern Slavery legislation. It emphasises will not knowingly use or contribute to modern slavery practices. So, and they're the types of practices that that Alex highlighted earlier on: child labour, forced labour, indentured labour, and so on. It emphasises working towards, and this is really important for a small business to be really honest with customers when they ask for a policy, that you say that, you know, we actively work to identify and eliminate modern slavery practices from our operations and supply chains within the resources available to you. And the policy provides, I guess, a commentary there around the understanding that ethics is an important part of your procurement considerations, which also include value for money and fit for purpose considerations. So an integrated approach there, but very much showing a level of responsibility there. And to be able to state this level of responsibility, work needs to be done within your own operations and your own supply chains, and we'll get to that shortly. The second area here is around risks. So the policy outlines potential ethical risks inherent in the supply chains of promotional products. We've talked about some of those. It also lists the types of vulnerable people that may be impacted along your value chain. So thinking about where the manufacturing is happening, the types of vulnerable people that may be in those jurisdictions. So Sean mentioned about geographic risks, industry sector risks, and commodity risks, and Alex showed some imagery around child labour in cotton plantations and in mining of mica and so on. So thinking about that. Also importantly here is use of contract workers, including low skilled or temporary migrants anywhere along our extended supply chain, including in Australia, because it's very much a risk within Australian supply chains as well, women and girls and so on. And an acknowledgement that often modern slavery and environmental degradation kind of go hand in hand. So poor environmental practices will often be linked to poor labour rights practices in the supply chain as well. The third section of the policy talks about commitment. So, and this is really based around an industry-wide acknowledgement of the risks. So the policy up front says, we know we're in a high-risk industry sector. There's no denying that. And what you want to do is what you can do within the resources you have. So build meaningful relationships with your suppliers, educate and support them in addressing modern slavery risks, and encouraging your customers or your clients to also do that with you. Just like Sean said, they're going to help their SMEs to get this right, because their risk is obviously, the supplier's risk is obviously Sean's risk as well. So increasing the awareness of modern slavery, providing information on actions taken to address it, and so on. So your business operations need to be considered, and that's things like, you know, what pressure are you perhaps putting on suppliers or manufacturers? Short turnaround time, lowest cost products, those sorts of things. So consider the types of influence that you may have, and how you may inadvertently cause corners to be cut in terms of health and safety of workers, overtime payment of workers, and that sort of thing as well. And then the policy talks about leveraging collective purchasing power to influence a wider market. So that's through your industry association, obviously, to really start to empower this sector and to demonstrate that you're doing that collaboratively and hopefully then reducing those risks throughout the supply chain. So the legislation asks businesses to assess and address their risk. It doesn't ask businesses to end slavery. So if you can help those reporting entities to assess and address that risk, that's what they're asking you to do. So thinking about how you can access this policy and make it your own and demonstrate to your clients, your customers, that you are taking this seriously is what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about now. But before I do, it's really important to remember that a modern slavery policy will not set people free. So a policy is words on a piece of paper. It's the implementation of those words. It's the action you take to address the impacts on the people working in your supply chain where the differences will occur. So we see a lot of questions when we ask questions around what due diligence processes do you have in place. A lot of people say to us, a lot of companies, big companies, say to us, we've got policies, we've got codes of conduct, we've got contract clauses. What does that mean if you're not assessing and verifying that your suppliers are actually sticking to those things? So the policy alone isn't going to make a change. And I guess we really wanted to emphasize that. So you can access the policy. Firstly, you need to show commitment and undertake some education as well. And Wes will be communicating this further with all of you. So demonstrating genuine commitment to managing risks and protecting vulnerable workers obviously sends the message that you are ethically responsible business and enables meaningful engagement with your stakeholders. So one of the things that is part of this process will be to complete the no slavery modules. And these are 4 10-minute modules that will become, I guess, mandatory as part of sourcing this policy. They're only $10 each, so it's really affordable, but it gives you a really good understanding of modern slavery, of the risks in your supply chain, and of what you need to do to implement those changes. So that's one thing, and that's a really good piece of information to communicate to your clients or customers who are asking you what you're doing to assess risk on their behalf, is that you've done some training, that you've got a policy in place, that you're keeping up to date on the latest trends and information in this. And you, Alex, brought up a case just this week in WA where construction workers, vulnerable people, have been exploited on our shores. So, you know, keeping up to date with that information, publicly stating your commitment to it, but making sure that it's not a CSR activity. It's not a promotions activity for your business to say, we're doing, you know, we have an ethical supply chain, we don't have slavery anywhere in our supply chain. To say so is a big mistake, because as Alex said, if you haven't found it in your supply chain, you may just not be looking hard enough. So be really careful with the sorts of commentary that you put out there around this issue. Secondly, undertaking risk assessments, and it doesn't have to be as detailed and as comprehensive as what both Alex and Sean talked about. It can be you understanding who you buy from, you talking to, if you're a distributor, talking to your suppliers, and your suppliers who may be members of APPA talking to the manufacturers, and understanding, starting to map the risks in that supply chain. Where are the products sourced? Who's making them? Who's manufacturing them? Where are the raw materials coming from? So starting to understand that and prioritizing your suppliers based on that level of risk, and really engaging them in some conversations around that, and verifying what they're saying. If they're saying to you, we're FedEx certified, talk to Alex and say, what does that mean? He'll tell you it actually doesn't mean anything to be FedEx certified. If they're on FedEx, make sure that their suppliers are answering the questions, that they're reviewing those audit reports. FedEx doesn't certify businesses. So being really careful around the language that you're using and that your suppliers are using. If they've got ISO certifications for environmental management or quality, ask them, well, how does that relate back to modern slavery? Don't take certifications as meaning they have systems and processes in place. There is no certification against modern slavery. So there are SA 8000 audits, there's SMETA audits, but they're all snapshots in time. So be really conscious of not overstating the importance of those things either. So and identify and modify your own operational practices around this. So as I said before, short turnaround times, purchasing seasonally, requiring large amounts of product, tactical or spot buying, all of these things add to the risk of slavery in your supply chain, of the pressures that you may be inadvertently putting on your suppliers. Thirdly, engagement. We've talked a bit about this. Really think about engaging your stakeholders, engaging your suppliers, your customers, your distributors, working collaboratively across your sector to ensure better outcomes across the supply chain. Developing some simple communication strategies. What do you want to know? How are you going to communicate that to people within your supply chain and back up to your customers as well? And share your story, share your challenges with other APPA members so you can work together to really address this issue in a collaborative and comprehensive way. Sean talked about corrective actions. So if you've got risk programs, if you're looking at risk management around safety issues or quality issues within your supply chain, integrate this issue into that. And you may already have systems in place where you're asking your suppliers or your manufacturers to demonstrate to you how they're managing different types of risks, integrate modern slavery risk into that and build meaningful relationships with those suppliers, provide feedback to those suppliers and other stakeholders. And continuous improvement is so important as part of this. So it's not a one-off, it's not a tick and flick, it's not a we've got a policy, you know, we're great. It's we've got a policy and the policy drives the actions we take. It sets a high level commitment. It's linked to our code of conduct as APPA members, but every year we're taking actions and we're improving on our previous year's efforts to address this issue. And document, keep records of the steps you're taking so you can communicate that to your customers when they're starting to ask you these difficult questions, as we asked to Real Pet Food in the gap analysis. And they're not easy questions to answer, but if you document the sorts of steps you're taking, even attending this seminar, for example, this webinar, is an important indicator for your customers that you're taking this seriously. So, and regularly review your own management systems and processes. So the policy is going to be available to members, but only those members who are serious about really addressing this issue. We've developed a little implementation guide for you as well. Now, if I slide this over, can you see that on the screen now? Does that come up, Wes? No? Okay, we'll send it to you if you do adopt the policy. It basically is a PowerPoint presentation in a 2-pager with some links to some of those resources Alex mentioned before as well, where you can get more information on how to roll this out. The 4 10-minute e-learning modules you'll be required to complete. As I said, they're available from the SD Strategies website. But if there's other modules that you know about or that you've already completed, then have that discussion with Wes as well, and really continue the conversations with each other and through the membership you have with APPA, and review your policy and your actions on an ongoing basis. So I'll leave it there and hand back to Wes for any questions.
Okay, we do have one question here. No, sorry, that's Adrian saying thank you to everyone. That's great insights. Okay, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. But Sonia, looks like we will wrap up. So thank you very much for your time as well. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I'm really pleased that APPA has started this modern slavery journey with our members as well. Some of the things I just wrote down from your presentation that really struck a chord. the policy drives the actions we take. And I think that's very important to communicate again to all of our members that the action and the wording of the policy will make the difference, not the policy itself. And it's not a ticket flick exercise. And I will communicate that again when I do send out access or further information on how to access the training that Sonia covered off, the support documentation that goes with the policy as well. I have been recording this presentation, so I will send a link so you can watch that again as well. Now, a couple of questions may have come through, Sonia. So Diana, can you give an idea of time and cost commitment to implement a policy?
That's a great question. And it was a question that was asked by a lot of companies when the government started to talk about rolling out this modern slavery legislation. And it's a really difficult one to answer, obviously. You'll need to obviously do the training. That's a really low cost part of that process. The cost for you will be mostly in really starting to assess the risks in your supply chain. Now, you can do that yourselves. You can look at the resources available, come up with 10 questions to ask your suppliers and analyze that information. So you don't need to use consultants to do that for you. So that would keep it at that much lower cost as well. So, and it really does, it depends on how many suppliers you've got, where you're sourcing your products from, how you're going to access the information from your suppliers. That's the implementation part of that policy, assessing and addressing those risks and working towards it. And remember, you don't have to do everything in the first year. Like Sean said, get yourself an action plan. So these are the main steps we want to do, and then cost that out over 2 or 3 years. So that's not a very exact answer because I actually don't know how much it's going to cost for each of you to do this, because it really depends on your business, how many suppliers you have, what type of APPA member you are, whether you're a manufacturer, whether you're a supplier, whether you're a distributor, and so on.
And I think a key point that you might have made earlier too, Sonia, was just that open and transparent communication with the supplier as well.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Okay, well, I think that's a wrap, everyone. So again, thanks for joining. Further information will be available. And if you do want to make contact with Sonia, her email is obviously on the screen. And if you want to get in contact with Alex, you can email me as well.